this episode of How to Read the Bible, we're going to dive into genres, and in specific, I'm going to focus on the Gospels a little bit. But before we get there, we need to understand the structure of the Bible. So there are 39 Old Testament books and 27 New Testament books. So the Old Testament starts with this section of 5 books called the Pentateuch, or the Law, and then it goes into the historical narrative books, and then there's wisdom and poetry. And these are all different genres, and there's other genres within these genres, but this is a basic way to break it up. Then you have major and minor prophets, and they're not major and minor based on importance or priority. They're major and minor simply just because of length. And then you have the New Testament books, which starts off with the 4 Gospels, and then the historical narrative of the church, which is Acts. That's Luke wrote, an extension of his gospel, which was Acts. And then the letters, which was the epistles, and when they canonized scripture, they basically just lumped them all together. And there's a whole list of letters, which were letters addressing church issues and churches. And then you have Revelation, which is primarily like what we call apocalyptic literature, which is a fascinating book, an amazing book, reading Revelation. So we have like law, prophecy, poetry, wisdom, all these different things, apocalyptic, and understanding the different genre and what we're reading at the time that we're learning how to read the Bible helps us interpret the text. So I want to pick out a few and just maybe highlight narrative. Narrative has the largest percentage of genre in the Bible. So this is a typical narrative, like there's a plot, there's a beginning, a middle, an end, there's a setup, there's a crisis or a conflict and a resolution. There's characters, so when we're reading narrative, we are relating to the characters. And something that we should also think about with characters is just because a character did it, it's not necessarily a code of morality, okay? So if a character did it in the Bible, even if they're used by God, that's not necessarily, we're not interpreting that, well, they did it, so should I, okay? So it's just simply in context in the story, and this is the way, this is who God used at the time. There's a setting in the narrative, and there's also a narrator telling the story. So understanding who the narrator is, understanding what their background is, this is all key when interpreting scripture. And so they might write it in third person or first person, and they might use different rhetorical discourse. So like they'll use symbolism, irony, repetition, rhetorical questions, simile, like metaphor, all these different things that you see in normal literature, you can see it in the text. And to know and recognize at the time of what you're reading, what's going on, is like very key and very important. And they might, even the narrator might actually persuade us to think in a certain way. To understand that's happening at the time can also be key in understanding the text. The epistles that I already talked about, the letters of Paul, understanding that these are, you're not actually always knowing what the issue was. I mean, in the letter, you can see it, what's being addressed, but it's a letter, it's a one-way letter. So you're not getting the other side of the story, but it's there for doctrinal instruction mainly. And so these are occasional responses. So there was something that was going on at that time and an occasion that Paul was addressing, and understanding the context to all that for that genre is super key. Now, let's talk about the Gospels. And what I'm going to draw attention to is this book. This is a really great book, 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus, by Richard A. Burridge. This is where I'm getting this content from in this session. So I just want to highlight that. And so why are there 4 different Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's a great question. And so I am one person. My name is Sam, okay? Now, I'm like a family man. I'm like a husband and a father. I've got a employment life, so I'm a boss, and I've got staff members, and I've also got a pastoral life. I'm a preacher and a pastor, and I do other things. Like I've got hobbies and things like, I don't know, I like playing golf. So if you took a photo of me being a family man, or a photo of me playing golf, or a photo of me in my office, those photos would each be a portrait telling a different picture of who I am. And that's kind of a good way to look at the 4 different Gospels. Is there a different depiction of the same man to give us greater appreciation and greater enhancement of our understanding as to who he is. So one thing is one gospel is not better than the other, okay? So, and also what we're not trying to do is take all the four gospels and mash them up into one gospel. So if we read everything, then we can understand it from one point of view. That's not, if there didn't need to be four, we wouldn't have four. So we need to leave them as they are and respecting them each for their own right. So in this book, Four Gospels, One Jesus, Burridge talks about the four different portraits of Jesus, and he uses Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 10, which is the four living creatures. So this is the creature of a man, this is the creature of an ox, a lion, and an eagle, and he uses these images as the four depictions of the gospel of Jesus. And I just think this is really cool, and I thought this is really helpful to show you and of this imagery to help you understand when you're approaching the different gospels. So the first one, Matthew, is the human. So this is the human living creature. And this is the teacher who provides his presence for obtaining righteousness. Now, why is it obtaining righteousness? Because Matthew was a Jew and he had Jewish roots, and he was writing primarily to the Jews. So he uses names, and we get these indications like son of David and son of Abraham to appeal to the Jews. And he presents Jesus as the teacher of righteousness. And you can see that seek first the kingdom and his righteousness from Matthew 6. So in Matthew, there is 5 like extended sermons of teaching. And so Burridge says it like this: the human form symbolized revelation and intelligence. According to the Old Testament, the definition of being human is to have understanding. So Matthew's message to the Jews was to understand about the presence of Jesus in our lives for obtaining righteousness. What is the path for obtaining righteousness? And it is that Jesus is the teacher of Israel, and he is here with us, and if we believe in him, we are made right. And so we see at Matthew 28 verse 20, right at the end of this gospel, we see this pointing to Jesus being with us. He says this: I am surely with you always to the very end of the age. And this would have been very reassuring for any Jewish believer. Okay, so Mark, this is the lion. So Mark's like a completely different gospel. This is the king coming to claim his kingdom. And Mark, even the nature of Mark, it starts abruptly. It's aggressive. It's like a lion leaping out of the pages. It's awesome. Mark is a really exciting book. It's action-oriented and it's to the point. Like Mark, it's quick. And Burridge says this: there is no systematic account of Jesus' teachings in Mark, despite calling him teacher. Mark's Jesus is a creature of action. So it's fast-paced miracles, boom, straight away when you start reading Mark. The lion is symbolized in John the Baptist, a voice of one crying out or roaring out in the wilderness. And Burridge says Mark's style is brief and terse, preferring concrete action to abstract discourse. It's colloquial, it's designed for easy listening rather than for those close attention to the required by a written text. The lion does not deliver polished oratory. He roars, and his message and his roar is clear. So the lion is the king, and the king is coming to claim his kingdom through death. That's kind of Mark's kind of message. I think that's a cool take. Then Luke is like the ox. So Luke then is like a whole nother different approach and another different portrait. So the ox is the submissive servant who came to lay his life down. I think this stuff is so cool. Came to lay his life down. So the ox is slow. And Luke is the longest account. Luke actually, between Luke and Acts, has the most text than any other New Testament writer. So there is more Luke in the New Testament than there is Paul in the New Testament, which is kind of crazy. So the ox is slow. It's the longest account. It's slower in approach, and it starts with Jesus' parents before birth. So it even starts way back. Luke's message is the ox bearer of burdens, this sacrificial animal to atone for sin, sacrificially shouldering the weight of sin. Luke deepens our gratitude for Jesus' submission and willingness to fulfill the Father's will. That's kind of Luke's message in the gospel. And then John, the eagle, and this is my personal favorite, is Jesus above all. So the eagle is soaring, and it's this, right out. John starts with the cosmic scene of creation, that in the Word and it was like a higher perspective, that the eagle sees further and flies higher. And the words life and light are used twice as often in John than any other three synoptic gospels put together. And these things, life and light, are found in Jesus through revelation and sight, seeing and having a godly perspective. So that is John's portrayal, is this heavenly, godly perspective. And it ends with Jesus restoring vision, sight, to Peter, like his vision, and while they're eating breakfast by the sea, and he recommissions him to be a disciple maker and to live for his higher purpose. Don't settle to be a fisherman, keep being a fisherman of men, which I love that idea in the Gospel of John. So this overview of the Gospels, I hope, gives you an appreciation to the portraits of Jesus that Burge is talking about in his book. So when recognizing and appreciating Gospels, it will help us in how to read the Bible.